Hello, everyone. Welcome to our community briefing for Energy Justice in Washington and Energy for All, House Bill 1490. Thanks for taking time out of your day to learn more about this bill. And I hope lend your support to ensuring that the bill is brought before the legislature for consideration and passed so that we can see more and better securing of the energy rights of all of our citizens and everyone in Washington. My name is Mariel Therasingham. I'm Clean Energy Policy Lead with Front and Centered. Front and Centered is a coalition of people of color-led organizations and people of color community serving organizations across the state of Washington. And we bring policy, bring kind of the perspective of frontline communities and the interests of these communities to policy spaces where climate and environmental and energy and transportation and all of these issues are discussed and decided to ensure that communities are heard and the community's interests come front and centered in those kind of considerations. So we have, I want to take some time just to let you know how our briefing is going to play out. We're going to start with an overview of Energy for All, which is House Bill 1490. And it is up for consideration in the legislature. And we helped develop this proposal in order to kind of secure access to affordable energy in Washington for those who are most vulnerable to disconnections, to being cut off from that. I will also hear from Representative Kirsten Harris-Talley, our key sponsor and legislative champion for on this bill and on kind of more broadly, a lot of our energy justice kind of goals. So we're very, very honored that Representative Harris-Talley could join us today. You'll hear from Guillermo Rogel, as well, our legislative advocate with Front and Centered, and from key members of our team, of our kind of policy team who are with coalition organizations and have a lot of learning from their own work around community needs and interests for a more just and equitable energy system in Washington. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen just to kick off the overview of energy justice and kind of more specifically, kind of Energy for All, this bill that is kind of live. It's already filed due to having brought it up last year in the legislature, but we're coming back with 2.0 version and substitute this year, and really hope to see it kind of progress. We'll also have some time at the end for, I think there we go, for Q&A and discussion. So I really hope that everyone is able to bring up your questions. Can everyone see my screen? Anyone who could go with me?
Yeah, Maria, we can see.
Okay. Great. Actually, we can make sure I can actually share this. Okay, so I went over the overview, and I'm just going to get into it on Energy for All. So energy justice in Washington is really critical because energy undergirds everything about how our economy works, about how we're able to kind of engage with the technology that is a part of all of our daily lives, from cooking, warming our homes, even just being mobile in the community, but particularly around residential energy usage, especially in a time of pandemic, a time where people are spending a lot more time at home. In the winter months, when it's colder outside, people are spending a lot more time at home. But basically at all times and in all ways, energy is crucial, and then having access to kind of secure power and heating sources at home is really critical to health and well-being. But the costs of energy right now are entirely within a market mechanism where it's kind of pay to play, and they fall heavily on people who really take a big hit on their incomes in order to sustain access to just keeping their heat going and access to power. So there's broad acknowledgement that utilities are essential and residential utilities need extra protection and we have temporary measures, and we have some energy assistance kind of built into the legislative kind of framework, or kind of our legal framework, and it doesn't go far enough. We, during the pandemic, front and centered, supported some really strong advocacy for extending the moratorium that the governor had on disconnections in Washington. And from having the moratorium extended, we determined that we really need more. We need to kind of go further for something more permanent, for something that really looks at the structures of why what's wrong with the structure, why is there a need, why are there many people facing disconnections, having rising debt in times of particular economic and health insecurity, but basically at all times, because disconnections have been a feature of how the energy market and how kind of utilities function for as long as they have been around. So really looking at what structural change could look like with a variety of partners, including Puget Sound Sage and other members of our coalition and partners who are engaged in consumer interests. We developed Energy for All, the idea of capping energy costs according to income level, and offering kind of this mechanism to really strongly limit opportunities for disconnecting people from power at any time of year. So there is an existing winter moratorium where people have kind of during the time limit of November to March, a payment plan option for kind of reducing month-to-month costs and to make them more manageable. And Energy for All goes further. This needs to be an option at all times, not just seasonal, to move towards a fair system for how rates shake out and how the costs of energy fall across people of widely disparate income levels and abilities to pay. That's critical for acknowledging a right to energy that we all have, and for setting us up to a more just system and a system where we can make advances in progressing in the clean energy transition, where we're not held to higher emitting kind of fuel sources in order to keep costs down and not have them fall unjustly. If we have structures to ensure that people can get access to the energy they need for their homes, and that is embedded in kind of rate structures and how utilities are costing out the prices for customers, then we can move forward more strongly in making the investments and kind of the policy moves needed for the clean transition, which have their own variety of costs, but those costs cannot and will not, should not and will not fall disparately on those who are most vulnerable to disconnections and most vulnerable to not having access to or having to divert household revenue from other needs like food and health in order to pay for utilities, or just vulnerable to disconnections just because they can't. And so a little bit more on the proposal, which has developed a bit since it was initially proposed in kind of last year's legislative session. It kind of reduces disconnections because it sets energy at a more affordable level for low income households and households with people with disabilities. The affordable cap is 3% of household income, which is a cap. It's an upper level. Utility costs for energy can't be higher than 3%. And that would be for low income households defined by households making 100% of federal poverty level or 80% of area median income, the higher of, and households with residents with disabilities would be eligible for the 3% cap percentage of income payment plan, which is defined relative to household income, which really sets that standard more closely to where people are meeting customers at the point of how their income is established, which is also important for just recognizing the dignity of the customer as holding their need, and affordability just being very, very different depending on kind of the different features that utilities can't peg and can't just put people kind of in different tier brackets without really acknowledging where customers stand, and that can be that can change. So a cap at household income level, payment into this payment plan sustained for a year would allow for relief of the debt of the past due balances that had accrued to the household, and it can be sustained indefinitely, so that this payment plan option would essentially be where households could kind of continue to pay into and access the energy they need. There are thresholds, so it's not access to unlimited energy, but it's access to energy above the average usage need for kind of the respective utility territories. This is just important for recognizing that different households, due to their size, due to the household type, age, and other factors, need different. They need kind of different amounts of energy to keep their house warm, to keep their power going for their devices and other use. And so those are the kind of key features of the bill, as well as a commerce program where we look at different, or where commerce, the Department of Commerce will collect information on key points of energy usage, need, disconnections, and the distribution of costs, how many of the costs are falling on low-income customers relative to other revenues from the utility, to move towards a fairer standard for kind of utility rates, and ensure that we are on track for a more progressive energy system where everyone has access to what they need to sustain their well-beings, to survive and to thrive, and that the costs fall in an equitable way, and are not determined solely by kind of market factors, and that the standard applies for all Washingtonians. So it's not utility by utility, because right now the assistance infrastructure is very much utility by utility, and it looks different. And but the need, that there is need across the board in all parts of the state, and we want just Energy for All to set a standard for a standard that we can continue to build on for having more progressive energy access in Washington. So I think next, actually, I'd like to hear from, or we're going to hear from Guillermo, who also has some slides to share.
Great. Thank you, Marielle. I have a slide to share, but with some information on there. So I'm going to share my screen really quick. Okay. So hi, everyone. My name is Guillermo Rogel. I am the Legislative and Government Relations Advocate with Front and Centered. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us. As we enter this legislative session, we know that we're going to need a lot of help from our community members who are within the Front and Centered Coalition, but then also from allies and from folks around the state who are going to be impacted by this bill. So I wanted to take the time today to just introduce some of the concepts that we're heading into this session, because energy justice for all falls into this larger just transition framework that we're trying to get Washington to achieve. And we're going to do that through this legislation. So what we're trying to do really at a high level is to embed environmental justice and just transition mechanisms into new and existing legislation. And this is an opportunity to create a new structure, which we know is going to ultimately benefit folks who are going into debt and having to prioritize their basic needs. So we're really trying to challenge the structures that exist right now and also challenge the status quo, which is not the easiest thing to do in Olympia and the state legislature, even more difficult to do, especially during a short legislative session. But we know that the lives of our community members all across Washington state have been severely impacted, not just by the COVID crisis, but by existing systemic racism, pollution that was already occurring even prior to COVID, so we know that we can't really wait to really challenge the structures or status quo. And we just have to make sure that we're passing laws and policies as they come to us from community members. There's also existing energy assistance programs that are not being accessed by community members who are in debt, who are having to prioritize their basic needs, which is another reason why we need to pass this bill. What we're really shooting for in the framework of this just transition is a just energy system. And a just energy system is one that preserves human life, ecological dignity, and really puts people over profit. And so when we're talking to legislators, we really want to talk to them about the impact that this issue is having on folks right now, but then also show them that we can change the structures and move more towards this just energy system, one that is really going to prioritize our communities ahead of anything else. So the good thing is that we are heading into this session with new and existing tools. So for those of you that were following our work last year with Front and Centered, you know that we were able to pass the Healthy Environment for All Act, which this at a state agency level is going to direct several state agencies to embed environmental justice into their work and also into their legislation that they're going to be prioritizing and proposing each year when they come back. We also have the newly established Environmental Justice Council, which actually just got appointed last Friday by Governor Inslee. And we're really going to be working in conjunction with them to help see how we can propel environmental justice even further. And that includes informing some of the legislation that even Front and Centered is going to be proposing on top of what state agencies are already doing. And we also have the environmental health disparities map, which just is a really valuable tool in showing us what are the existing health disparities that exist across Washington state and what kind of progress are we making in those communities. So we want this energy justice for all to be another way that we are moving towards a just transition, and hopefully is one of the tools and assistance programs that we can really help, that we can use for our communities. So yeah, ultimately, we want to make sure that we are moving towards equitable rates and that it's us who really controls our energy systems. So it's just a really high-level intro into our just transition framework and more of how the energy justice for all fits into our session. And I would love for you all to just, follow what we're doing here at Front and Centered and sign up for some updates. But again, I appreciate you all being here. And if you have any questions for me, my contact information, I'll drop it here at the end of the webinar so you all can reach out with any questions. Marielle, I will kick it back to you and stop sharing.
I'd love to invite Representative Harris-Talley to speak now.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for this overview, Marielle and Guillermo. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm Representative Kirsten Harris-Talley, she, her pronouns, and I have the honor of serving the 37th Legislative District, which includes Renton, Skyway, and Southeast Seattle. I am particularly honored to serve this district because it's currently the most diverse legislative district in Washington state. It's a district directly impacted by the legacy of redlining and other policy that we know has added to generations of environmental injustice. And there are many of the groups who are part of this coalition and this work deeply rooted in environmental justice here in the 37th. So I was particularly honored when Front and Centered asked me to champion this bill. The context of this moment, I think, with reflection of what was shared about what happened in legislative session in 2021 and what it means for 2022. I just want to note how moving it was to hear from neighbors in the hearing on the Energy for All bill about the very real reality of what it was to be in the moratorium and still find, right, what it is to not be able to catch up. And I say that because on two sides of this conversation, one is a set of utilities. And for folks in Washington state who don't sort of know about the energy infrastructure in Washington state, I describe it as a quilt. In the same way a quilt square is not necessarily the same, but each functions towards the same thing of creating the whole of a quilt. It's a lot of what our energy system is. It means we have for-profits, co-ops, nonprofit models, all as models for energy within our state. And the balance of those different systems and the response to this is really important to consider. Co-ops in central Washington sort of really had a hugely disproportionate impact of folks who really suffered when the pandemic hit, as did folks in my district. Of course, the energy systems in my district are all profit-driven models, right? So the response looked really different depending on where you were, what you were enduring during the pandemic, and what resources were going to be wrapped around you, depending on what the goals of that utility are and who is a part of them. So that is a really important context for this conversation, because what we've been having conversations over interim has been in the lifting time of moratoriums. So the conversation around us has shifted. At the same time, we're staying really deeply rooted in this conversation of equity. The details of this bill, right, are really focused on folks with disabilities and folks who are already really disadvantaged with their income for what it is to survive in our world. And right now, we only have responses for folks really dealing with the realities of what the hardships, let me be clear, not that their circumstance creates, but that our society creates because of their circumstance. Right now, we only have systems and resources at the state level to respond to those. We don't have a lot of conduits at the local levels with energy companies. So that change is a really big shift in this bill of what it is to put resources there and ask folks to administer at the local level. So I wanted to give that context because it's a really important thing I consider when I take on state policy, is when it's state policy that impacts local systems. That's a really different conversation, and for me a very exciting one, because of how unique our energy system is in Washington state and what it would be to know that no matter where I moved in the state, I knew that when I had need, I would have a response that would wrap care around me. The other piece that I want to note is that the fights around the HEAL Act and other pieces, we got over the finish line last year. And there were some really substantive shifts and some stuff that I'm a little worried about actually coming into 2022 as well. For folks who followed the Climate Commitment Act and those conversations, I know front and centered and stood with front and centered in voting against the Climate Commitment Act. But there were several provisions there that had really specific protections and considerations for sovereign tribes in our state that our governor vetoed. I was really disturbed by those vetoes. You're going to see conversations there again, revisiting, who are the folks that we're listening to and responding to in these situations. But what I was moved by from neighbors is them really talking about the reality of what it was to think about losing your utilities during COVID. And I know every person here, the context of this bill is the very real reality that every one of us have lived now through a pandemic where we know if we didn't have electricity, we wouldn't have been able to go to work. My children would not have been able to go to school. The very basics of what it has been to live through the pandemic has only been possible because of access to what utilities provide to us. So that reality in what it is to build this work, I want to thank everyone here for your work on the ground, for the conversations you're having locally, so that we can keep the momentum around this to really be looking at an equity standard that goes beyond the current systems we have, so that we can be very responsive to where folks' needs are. And while this is a consideration only for those who are most impoverished in our state and folks with disabilities, if we get this over the finish line, right, it opens up a whole new conversation because we're actually looking at a system shift with this, which I think is really, really important. I do also want to note that, coming out of the moratorium, we've been having conversations with a lot of utilities, particularly in rural and isolated parts of the state, about what it is, right, what folks are facing, the amounts of debt. The amount of debt that individual families are facing is extraordinary, levels we've never seen before. It is not unusual to be talking to folks who are looking at into the thousands amount of dollars that they are in the rears for their utilities if they had an inability to pay. What that then means is that for many of these utilities, they're holding an extraordinary amount of debt that they've never had to hold before. So there's a big conversation right now about the fact that the system that we have did not meet our need in a moment of crisis that I really want us to stay rooted in as we continue to have conversations, because the utilities, and even the ones who are working against this bill, also are having to face the very real reality of what they built and what they're going to have to do with this debt and what that's going to mean. So our neighbors who have already been suffering through the pandemic, now what I'm going to be looking at is any conduits to data, and we'll be working with front and center of others to know, are there going to be enough resources to help folks? I was encouraged to know that the governor did do a grant program coming out of more of the interim period to make sure some resources were provided at the local levels to try to have some of folks' individual family debts paid off. I am still working with the Department of Commerce to have a deeper understanding of the success of that and how much need was met versus how much there is. So I'm hoping that with Front and Centered and others, when we have that information, we can share it with you all to have a deeper understanding of what this means in real time. And I just want to thank you all for what it is to be really responsive in real time to what our communities need most, and building policy at those solutions. Because even as we move out, hopefully, of the pandemic in 2022, that doesn't mean that the issues that were raised by us knowing from the pandemic and what the moratorium period was means that we can let go of policy that should actually change systems that we know impacted folks really disproportionately during the pandemic. So thank you all again, and I look forward. I have time with you until 12:45, so looking forward to a chat and having conversation. I'll hand it back to you, Beth.
Thank you, Rep. Harris-Talley. I'd like to invite Katrina Peterson from Puget Sound Sage to share. Katrina has been a leader in advocating for energy justice, particularly energy security during the pandemic, and looking towards bigger solutions to systems change to move us towards more progressive and equitable standards for the energy system.
Thank you, Marielle, for that introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon with everyone. My time today, my goal is to actually share a little bit of history and data and context around the need that we have for energy security and policies that advance energy security and energy justice in our state, based on research that SAGE did actually prior to the pandemic that really helps us understand what was going on before the pandemic hit, knowing that the pandemic added another layer of crisis to our current situation. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Here we go. So between 2018 and 2020, SAGE conducted a community-based research project with about 500 community members throughout the South King County region, asking the question of what does a renewable energy transition look like to you, and what do you need in order to make it possible? And so the results and the data that I'm going to share are from this research project that we did. To kick us off, we worked with 11 different community-based organizations and one union. We worked in 10 different languages and did listening sessions, surveys with about 350 community members, and then one-on-one interviews with community leaders and government officials. And so what I'm about to share is a bunch of demographic information from that survey to help you understand who our communities are, who we were speaking to, and where they're coming from. So first off, overwhelmingly, the folks who participated in our survey were BIPOC, female, and low income. On top of that, 35% identified as having a disability, and 18% shared that they have or use an assistive mobility device or medicine that relies on energy in order for it to function. On this slide, I picked it out because I wanted to share that we're working with folks, 2/3 of whom speak a language other than English at home. These could be recent immigrants or folks who speak sovereign or religious languages. But point being, only 1/3 of them speak English only, and more than 2/3 speak a language other than English. So this is a slide that goes into the incomes of the households that we were surveying. These two bars over here, so this is 27% of our 350 respondents. So 27% of our respondents their household makes less than $10,000 a year. 21% of our survey respondents' households make between $10,000 and $30,000 a year. And I just want to remind folks that this is in the King County region. So imagine living off of $10,000 or $30,000 a year to support a full household. So over half of our households in this survey make less than $30,000 a year, and over 90% of our households make less than the area median income in King County. So these next couple of slides are going to go into the results that we found, particularly around energy and what our communities are experiencing in terms of how energy costs are increasing and impacting them. So to kick us off, what we learned is that the majority, 60%, and that's this first figure over here, 60% of our households have seen energy costs increase over the last 5 years. And an even greater majority of folks are concerned about increasing energy costs over the next 5 years. And what we found is that when hit with an energy bill that's $50 a month or higher, folks are cutting basic needs in order to pay for these energy bills. So what that means is that they are reducing their use of heating and cooling. Imagine that during the cold of the winter and the heat of our abnormally hot summers these days. They're unplugging their appliances, and they're cutting other necessities, right? So they are cutting rent and mortgage costs, they're cutting food, medicine, clothing, childcare, and elder care. And finally, this is my last slide that has to do with energy costs and low-income bill assistance. What we found is that current existing low-income bill assistance programs prior to the pandemic weren't meeting the existing need. So one of the things that's important to share is that the residents that we were surveying straddled 2 different utility districts, to Representative Kirsten Harris Talley's point about how Washington State is a fabric of different utility models. In our region, we have Seattle City Light, who covers residents who primarily fall within Seattle city bounds, and then some who fall outside of that. And then we have Puget Sound Energy, who serves customers who live outside of Seattle. And what we found, and just to make one other point, Puget Sound Energy is a for-profit utility. They're accountable to a board of investors, whereas Seattle City Light is a public utility district, a community-owned utility, and they're accountable to Seattle city voters. So they're very different models, very different accountability systems. And so what we find, actually, let's look at this graph on the right. In our survey, we found that of the folks who are eligible within Seattle city limits for low-income energy assistance, about 72% were getting the assistance that they need. Whereas outside of Seattle, and this is largely within Puget Sound Energy's service territory, only 33% of eligible households were receiving low-income bill assistance. And then this is a graph from prior to the pandemic about what the income qualification thresholds are for households in order to qualify for low-income energy assistance. So as you can see, Seattle City Light is able to offer households of 1 or 2 folks, and their income can be higher in order to qualify for energy assistance, where Puget Sound Energy, the energy assistance income level thresholds are a lot lower, which means that for folks in need who live outside of Seattle city bounds aren't able to access the same sort of energy assistance as folks who live within Seattle city bounds. And layered on top of that is the fact that low-income households are increasingly being displaced, if they haven't already been displaced, to outside of Seattle city bounds because of gentrification and rising living costs. And so that's just exacerbating the fact that, outside of Seattle, there are fewer benefits that can be accessed than inside of Seattle. So I'm going to stop sharing there, and I just wanted to close with a couple of other points. The first is that this local research that we did actually mirrors national research. So The US Department of Energy found that the national average energy burden for low-income households is 8.6%, which is 3 times higher than that for non-low-income households, which is at 3%. And so that's part of how we arrived at the 3% cap for low-income households, is knowing that non-low-income households are putting 3% of their household income towards energy, and that low-income households should not be disproportionately burdened by energy in order to be able to afford it. And something else that that national study found is that energy burden can be as high as 30%. So for some households, they're putting 30% of their whole income towards energy. And what we found in our listening sessions was that some folks were reporting that as well within our communities. And then the one other resource that I want to reference is that Duke put out a study at the beginning of last year looking into the impacts of the moratoria that had been put in place throughout the country. And what they found is that keeping people connected to energy actually saves people's lives. So what they found is that places where there are moratoria in existence reduce COVID-19 infections by 4.4% and mortality rates by 7.4%. So to close, I just want to share that I'm really excited to support this legislation because I see it as a systemic solution and a fix to a currently unjust energy system that we have. And as I look forward to the increasing climate impacts that we're going to be experiencing, health impacts, economic experiences that we'll likely experience as a result of the climate crisis, putting in place systems that help us be more resilient to those impacts will only serve both us as communities, BIPOC communities and individuals, but also the health of the whole state, because we will be more resilient to these future impacts. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that, Katrina. I'd like to take a moment before inviting Paul to speak. We have Representative Harris-Talley on the call for another 5 minutes. And so I'd like anyone who has a question that they'd like to direct to Rep. KHD or to Representative Harris-Talley to put that in the chat so that we can get to that within the time that she's still here after Paul's talking, and also to let you know that you'll be seeing a poll shortly with just a few questions about your experience with this briefing, and if you're interested in kind of learning more and being a part of our advocacy to get energy for all in Washington. Thanks. Paul.
Hello, my name is Paul Tabayoyan. In my day job, I work as a community outreach coordinator for the Asian Pacific Islander Coalition here in Yakima. So we are an Eastern Washington rural community. And that's really what I'd like to speak on today is I'm a systems guy. So understanding how COVID actually affects our community as a whole. And then when we have the lack of energy also in the mix with similar things. And then we have the addition of the income stresses and the economical and social stresses that have really been generated through COVID. We have a really large picture developing in the community here in Eastern Washington that I feel I'm very concerned about. And as a recent integrated energy manager graduate from Central Washington, one of our focuses is always looking at the externalities, which are the negative impacts of policy and really what they've done over time. So I was fortunate enough to work when the wind turbines in the wind turbine industry when they first came into Washington. So I witnessed how federal law really did affect state law when it comes to power transmission. And this is also one of the concerns that we developed for Central Washington. We have a out-of-state electrical supplier who really does not create new programs. That's something that through the CETA process, it's been identified that they haven't grown programs to really provide for their customers. Here in Eastern Washington, if you have a rearment issues, especially in Yakima County, you only have one provider for North County and one provider for South County. As in our outreach community efforts, we did witness community members having very large amounts of rearment and then trying to enter these programs, the difficulties they had, not only in contacting the programs themselves because of the small number of employees or, the unpreparedness because of the situation that was brought to us by COVID. But over the long term, what it really becomes is a financial indenture to the power company where we see that they really will be paying for years and years, according to some of these programs that we've witnessed. And I feel that HB 1490 would be one of these breaking links, not only to help stop the moratorium process from continuing and kind of wasting our legislators' time when we know we can create a simple fix for our most vulnerable community, but we can also begin the process, as it was mentioned, for CETA to help understand what are our electrical needs across our state from the different urban to rural perspectives. I personally, very much as a systems analyst, would love to see the demographic data of income level, who's been shut off, what the health effects and how the counties in those areas, such as Yakima County and rural communities, how do they deal with certain areas of the communities that may find, because of low income, that they are seeing larger numbers of disconnections, which means no hot water, which means health issues. And we do completely understand that in Eastern Washington, many agricultural families live in multifamily dwellings. They actually they move between dwellings. Families have large families, they have friends. These are communities that work together. So when we look at who has access to power and really how this can develop and really help the CETA process as a beginning point for energy use, I see some of the demographic data that we can collect for the Department of Commerce really being one of those driving points to help our communities identify, are we overusing in our electrical use? Are we underusing? Do we have more resources? And more importantly, how can those utilities redirect their efforts and energy to actually make sure that all of our communities have equal opportunity to growth? I don't want to see our agriculture community have to struggle with the stresses of ongoing COVID, because we do have families with constant stress of dealing with this. Do I pay for power or do I pay for my rent? Do I pay for power or do I pay for food? Do I actually keep my internet to keep my children educated during this difficult time if the school chooses to go back to online learning? So we do see that the electrical base that we have in our communities is very important. So I would encourage anybody that if they have questions about the bill, please do contact all of our entities through Front and Centered and Mario. Yeah, contact Mario. And if you're local in the community in Yakima, please feel free to contact myself as well, Paul Tabioyan of yakimaapic.org. We can have, that's our goal, is to connect our community with the information that's there, and then also be able to encourage the community, tell their stories, bring their testimonies, and really help to inform the committees that we have limited access to, and our legislators that may be disconnected from the actual issues and the potential detriment to our actual systems of agriculture that exist. So thank you for giving me a few minutes, and I hope that you can understand the differences, the large differences between the urban and rural communities, and how this bill can help to kind of bridge that gap for our most disadvantaged community members. Thank you, and back to you, Mario.
Thank you so much, Paul. Representative Harris-Talley, and I've had to leave the call, but I really appreciate the remarks that she already shared. And I believe that she will be available. She's certainly closely in contact with our campaign on this bill. And if to the extent that there is any interest in reaching or hearing back from her, please let us know, and we can help make that connection or bring that information where it needs to be. We've already received a number of questions, I think primarily through the chat. So if you have more, kind of please drop them in the chat, because I'm just going to go in order of what we've seen. But firstly, I just want to follow up on one answer, or kind of one that I answered in the chat on the income levels for, or the level, the eligibility for the Energy for All kind of payment plan that's being proposed in HB 1490, that low income and households with residents with disabilities have access to. The income levels are essentially what we see in the Clean Energy Transformation Act, which is already established as law, and sets the threshold for low income or access to income qualified kind of assistance services at 200% of federal poverty level and 80% of area 80% of area median income, whichever is greater. There was a question as well that you saw an answer in the chat too, but just to kind of give it light in case someone's just listening. Someone asked about the environment or the Environmental Justice, Council, and the status of that. So Guillermo shared a link if anyone wants to find that link to get the details on kind of the current membership of the council. And if anyone has follow-up questions about HEAL Act implementation and the council, there will be other opportunities certainly to connect with Guillermo and with Front and Centered about how we're involved and what we are seeing right now in implementation of HEAL and environmental justice in our state systems. I would like to go through these questions, and also if there were any questions intended for any speakers who are still on the call, particularly, but you didn't name the speaker, then just please flag that for me. So there was a question about connections between kind of this campaign and Energy for All and other campaigns, which is like other campaigns for forming kind of public utility districts in areas which are currently served by investor-owned utilities or for-profit utilities. And there's no direct connection. Those are two different tracks for kind of mechanisms to get to a place where energy utilities and energy service in general is more public facing and more responsive to customers and people. But this isn't necessarily about kind of more democratization of utility sector per se, although there is a lot of interesting movement there, and we hope people are tracking that. But this is specifically about setting a standard that all utilities will be subject to, regardless of whether they're not-for-profit consumer-owned utilities, which range from small co-ops that serve just a few thousand customers to many, many thousand hundreds of thousands of customers, depending on like that municipal public utility district and municipal utilities serve. In Washington, there are over 60, I think almost 70 energy utilities servicing Washingtonians right now with with electricity and gas. And Energy for All would apply to all utilities in terms of the bills that they send to their customers and what that number looks like, depending on customer income level. And then there's a question about how the legislation applies to renters. And looking at incentivizing landlords to insulate and replace expensive resistance-based board heat, and some of the kind of structures for weatherization and trying to improve efficiency for homes. Very, very important with this legislation, or that this proposal is not specifically about that, though there are important efforts happening to increase the levels of funding for greater weatherization and efficiency services, particularly for multifamily households and renter households. Right now, energy assistance is available for renters in different forms, and this bill basically builds on that. So it would just be adjusting some of the assistance systems to a different kind of threshold for who is eligible, how qualifying households can access this protection, and reducing the barriers to access, and then what that cap looks like for qualifying households, but doesn't specifically touch on kind of home efficiency. But it is absolutely available for residents who are customers, who are kind of in the system, and their income levels and other knowledge about their energy burden and their energy assistance need is able to be tracked by, we currently have CAP agencies that are a lot of the kind of assistance, the different types of assistance program working with utilities, and some utilities are managing their own. But that is like to the extent that renters are customers, which they are. I mean, everyone who has a home and that home is wired up and connected to these utilities, they are part of the system. And it does get more complicated for renters whose energy and other utility costs are part of their rent, but how that is parceled out, there are current systems for that. And so Energy for All actually flips pretty neatly into the existing energy assistance infrastructure. It just helps it helps it go further to meet greater need towards a more progressive standard. There's a question about PSC customers encounter some of the highest electricity rates? Is there some place to find comparisons of energy rates? There is no place, I think, that does a full comparison, but every utility has to kind of report on their rates. So that would be a project. I don't know of a place to find all of the information in one location for kind of comparison purposes. But if anyone can speak to that, please feel free to drop that info in the chat. I think there was a question about the debt relief portion of the proposal, which is a feature of the protection that would be offered to customers who are subscribing to or taking a part of the option, the percentage of an income payment plan option. And it is very clearly, like in a provision in the proposal, with payment into this payment plan for 12 months, there will be that relief. Right now, there's already a lot of process around how, there's already process, but it is kind of a functional process for how utilities, what they do with debt that has been long lasting for customers. They write off bad debt, and there are other systems for how that is essentially absorbed into how kind of they manage their revenues, including by kind of increasing rates across the board. And then this just needs to be kind of ramped up at scale and could include some special support depending on the need of the utility. And there would be higher need for some of the consumer-owned utilities who are facing some of this debt. A question for Katrina. We still have some time. Katrina, you're still here, right? Is a write-up of this study available? I'd love to kick that to you.
Yeah. So there are a couple of studies that I mentioned. I dropped a link in the chat for the Powering the Transition report, which is the report where I was that I was pulling all of that data from and the slides from about communities specifically living in King County. I also dropped a link in the chat about the Duke study, which found that moratoria on housing evictions and utility disconnections saved lives during the COVID pandemic. So that's also there. And then I think the other resource that I mentioned was a US Department of Energy study. So I can drop that link in the chat as well.
Thank you, Katrina. Yep, I would love to. I think my contact information is definitely on the site, and I can pop my email in the chat if anyone wants to discuss this with me or connect with our work group, our team who has been dedicated to developing the policy, doing a lot of stakeholder engagement and talking about it and trying to bring this before the legislature for more in-depth discussion and then hopefully progressing to actual being voted in and becoming part of our statutory framework for kind of energy.
Maria, I think I did
Yep.
want to add something to that part. So just for everyone's sake on where the bill is, it got heard it's a continuation of the bill from last year, which got a hearing. But it definitely the first committee it needs to get out of by January 28th, I believe, is the House Environment and Energy Committee. So we just need support there on moving members of that committee and the chair specifically to exec it out, which then we hopefully have another chance to appear before the Appropriations Committee. But yeah, I would appreciate your support in that. And yeah, just happy to be here as a resource.
Thank you, Guillermo.
Representative Fitzgibbon is the chair of that committee.
Yeah, on that point, we're going to just get an urgent action ask out pretty soon after this call, or definitely in the next couple days, for how folks can support us in that effort to make sure that this bill is heard. It is heard again, and it's heard better in its form, which is a substitute bill that we're filing, where we actually improve upon what was originally filed last year. We include the additional section on the data on energy usage and need program that Commerce would have to manage so that we can actually get a clear picture of what's of energy insecurity in Washington. Who's facing this? Why are they facing this? Why is it so? Why are these patterns of the burden falling more heavily on households and on communities that can't support it? Why it was not filed originally, but that's what we're bringing back, and so we want to make sure that this bill is heard. We're going to be asking you to help us do that. There were a couple other questions, and we do have a couple of minutes left in this, so I'll try my hand at them. And if I don't get to it all, then I want to thank everyone for joining, for filling out the poll if you're able to, for talking about this bill with your kind of different networks, for reaching out to your legislators. Your representative is Representative Fitzgibbon in particular. That would be great as the chair of the committee, hearing this, and just for your support for front and centered on this. So in the last minute, I'll touch on the questions. Does Energy for All include measures to hold landlords accountable for improving housing standards in which many folks live in? There are no provisions specific to housing rights in Energy for All, but we believe that the values that are captured in this protection align closely with those of tenants and of tenants' rights and securing access to affordable housing for everyone. And then how is energy burden defined? Is that percentage of overall household expenses? It's the percentage of household income dedicated to energy. So that would be the total of utilities, your gas bill, your electricity bill, and that percentage. Right now, it's average is about 3 to 4% in Washington, upwards of 10 to 12% for low-income Washingtonians, and then below 3% and well below 3% for a lot of the higher wealth Washingtonians. I think that covers some of the questions that people dropped, and really appreciate you all joining today. Please reach out to me. I don't know, I didn't get my email in here, but Charlie, if you could help that, please reach out to me, our team, if you want to learn more, or I think we'll have follow-ups also for everyone who's registered. Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday.